Today is day 4,430 that Boswell Book Company has been in business, and it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Jerry Enzler for a conversation about his book with Douglas Brinkley. Brinkley, our conversation partner this evening, is of course the Catherine Sarnoff Brown Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University, CNN presidential historian and author of books like American Moonshot and The Great Deluge and others. And he's here to interview and chat with Jerry Enzler. Jerry served as director of the National Mississippi River Museum and Aquarium for 37 years. He's curated national exhibitions. He's published historical articles, not just about Jim Bridger, but yes, about Jim Bridger, but about river history, many other topics. And he's here tonight with Jim Bridger, Trailblazer of the American West, his brand new biography. I think we're gonna have a fascinating conversation about it. So let me stop and turn it over. Jerry, Douglas, welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much. It's a joy to do this. And Jerry's an old friend of mine who did such great work for our country with the Mississippi River Museum in Iowa. It's one of the best museums that's been developed in the last 50 years. And I was once there talking to Jerry, and he mentioned to me he wanted to write a Jim Bridger biography. He was hell-bent on it. We talked about how you got to dig for documents, and it's a hard story to recreate. And lo and behold, he stayed with it, and here it is, and it's a magnificent biography of the legendary Rocky Mountain explorer, trailblazer, and icon of the frontier. And I wanted to begin, Jerry, by why don't you just give us kind of a quick synopsis of who Jim Bridger is. I imagine a lot of people heard the name, but maybe aren't quite sure. And if you would read a passage from the book, one that you're proud of.
I will. Before that, though, I want to say, I think the first time I met you, Doug, you and Stephen Ambrose were on a publicity tour for the Mississippi and the Making of a Nation.
Yeah.
And that was a real treat to both meet you and Stephen Ambrose at our fledgling museum, which was just growing at the time. And we've been friends ever since. So I appreciate you being with me tonight.
We were going up the Mississippi for Lewis and Clark, but we were doing the anniversary of the Louisiana Purchase, and went the whole length, Steve and I, for the National Geographic. It was amazing.
Yeah, it was great. So Jim Bridger is an amazing figure. He started a very unexpected promise. He was orphaned at age 12 and 13. When he was 8, he left his home with his family from Richmond, Virginia, and they went all the way to what's called the American Bottom across from St. Louis. And it was during the War of 1812 that they were making that journey. And when he was 12 and 13, he actually lived among the Potawatomi Indians because he was an apprentice to a well-known gunsmith, Philip Kramer. And I'll jump ahead because he went west under Mike Fink and Andrew Henry and William Ashley. And it was thousands of miles of journey. And Bridger immediately found his home. When he was 20 years old, he was the first one to discover that Salt Lake, first Euro-American, to discover that the Great Salt Lake was indeed very rich with salt. When he was 21, he rode the rapids of Bad Pass Rapids. When he was 22, he was among the group that entered what is today the boundaries of Yellowstone National Park. And he grew to a place where he was a partner at age 26 in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. And the passage I'm going to read is an exciting episode when he was one of the 5 partners, and they were wondering about whether they were going to go bankrupt and whether they could survive in the West.
All right.
So what's happening is the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, Bridger is a partner in that, and their opposition is the American Fur Company, which had been started by John Jacob Astor. So Vanderburg and Drips had gone to the Green River to get their supplies from Fontenelle. Then they picked up Bridger and Fitzpatrick's trail on the Dearborn River, a tributary of the Missouri. Bridger and Fitzpatrick led their brigade over the divide, and they ordered their men. They were so far. Let me go back. When a hunter shot a deer or an elk, the entire company had to pick the lone carcass to the bone. They were so scarce on food. They supplemented their food by eating the beaver meat. Bridger and Fitzpatrick changed course, but American Fur Company did not know where the furs were. So everywhere Rocky Mountain Fur Company went, the American Fur Company followed. Bridger and Fitzpatrick ordered their men to leave the campfires burning, and they slipped away. Vandenberg's scouts figured it out and followed Bridger and Fitzpatrick. One time, Fitzpatrick led the pack horses and camp keepers in one direction, while Bridger led the trappers in another. But the American Fur Company actually was onto that as well. Finally, they split up. They were at the Three Forks, and Vandenberg went to the Madison, and he was killed there by a blood Indian by the name of Eagle Ribs, and another man was killed also. Andrew Drips, also from the American Fur Company, had a man die, and Bridger was on the Gallatin River, and they faced an opponent whose name was Eagle Ribs. And George Catlin had just drawn his portrait, and so Eagle Ribs had not one, but two medicine bundles. And he boasted he had 8 scalps, which he had taken from the heads of trappers and traders by his own hand. He was a member of the Blackfeet Buffalo Society, which gave him the right to wear a pair of polished buffalo horns. So traveling with Bridger and Fitzpatrick was a spirited Mexican free trapper named Loretto. And Loretto had paired up with a Blackfeet woman. She had been captured by the Crows, and Loretto had paid her ransom, so she was now traveling with Bridger and the trappers. So these two forces were facing against each other, Eagle Ribs and the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Bridger rode out to meet Eagle Ribs. Eagle Ribs rode out to meet him. Eagle Ribs was extending his hand, and Bridger heard a movement, and with that, he cocked his rifle. When Eagle Ribs heard that, he grabbed the barrel of Bridger's rifle, and he twisted it downward, and the rifle discharged into the earth. Bridger struggled with Eagle Ribs over the rifle, and Bridger's horse turned. A Blackfeet drew his bow and arrow and let fly, and the arrow drove deep into Bridger's lower back. Then a second arrow pierced Bridger's back. Eagle Ribs wrested the rifle from Bridger's hands and struck him with it, felling him to the ground. Then Eagle Ribs leaped onto Bridger's horse to make his escape. Bridger later recalled, he was hit so hard as almost to break his neck. So that's some of the action scene that you're will read when you read the book.
How did he mend himself from that?
Well, it was quite a well. First of all, the battle was still going on, and so I think he laid in the dust for some time because he was out exposed in the center of these two huge forces. But once the Blackfeet retreated, his men came out and they tried to pull one of these arrowheads out. And it was so severe, they actually had to have 2 men. They had to put their feet on his back and pull as hard as they could, and one of them was extracted. The second one, they could not get out. It had like these barbs, and so once it goes in, it kind of stays in. And they were able to take the shaft off, but the arrowhead remained in his back for 3 years. And I like to say the arrowhead was roaming around his back for 3 years and giving him all kinds of pains. And 3 years later, Marcus Whitman arrived at the rendezvous, which is a grand celebration of trade and celebration that people have lived through the year. Marcus Whitman was not only a missionary going to Oregon, but he was a doctor. And so right there among the rendezvous and maybe 200 trappers and 400 to 500 indigenous peoples, usually Shoshone and Flathead, they watched as they did open back surgery, open air surgery actually, and they extracted that last arrowhead. But the pain actually bothered him through the rest of his life.
And of course, out in Walla Walla, Washington, Whitman College is named after Lucas Whitman. What is unique about Bridger? What was he was a great reader of topography. He had incredible endurance skills. But why is his name so legendary? There were a lot of people working with the fur companies and of that generation, but he seems to have been the one that's been turned into a folklore figure.
Yeah, very much so. He had this, he could not read nor write, but he could read the terrain, it turned out, better than almost anyone in his category. And so Jedediah Smith, one of the great explorers of the American West, Bridger was a pilot for him and actually led him where to go because Smith wasn't familiar with the Powder River and Yellowstone River country, and Bridger was. The passage I just read talks about the American Fur Company. They did not know where to find beaver. Bridger knew exactly where the beaver were. So he had this uncanny ability to almost memorize the terrain mile after mile after mile. They know which streams were poisonous, where you might find quicksand, where you might find some other potential threat. And then he also had this tremendous enthusiasm. He was very brave. I mean, he volunteered to ride the rapids down Bad Pass, even though the Crow Indians had said that this pass on the Bighorn River, there was a Manitou, an evil spirit that lived up there. He was the first known Euro-American to ride that on a raft single. He was the first to go through the Bear River Canyon and discover that Salt Lake is made of salt, significantly. He was among one of the first, when he was 21 years old, he and Thomas Fitzpatrick, who were 26, they led many men who were maybe 10 to 20 years older than them. They actually took charge because the Bannock Indians had stolen their horses. And Bridger said, well, I'm going to be one of the two. And he was just always right up front. And then he stayed out there. Bridger stayed from age 22, or from 1822 to 1868, almost entirely out there. He went 17 years without living in a fixed home or without even tasting bread.
How did you write the book? I mean, this is pretty much, I would call it a definitive biography of Jim Bridger. I don't think anybody's going to dig any deeper than you do, although there might be a rogue document here or there that surfaces. But what was Bridger's studies like before you started this? Could you find reliable secondary sources? And what were the primary sources you were able to mine?
Well, I found that many of the secondary sources they really were out of date. There was a 1946 version by Stanley Vestal over 75 years ago. There was one by J. Cecil Alter, and he had done pioneering work in the 1920s. And then he revised his 600-page book into a 300-page book in 1962. But it really didn't, it sometimes caused more confusion than it led to clarity. And there were obviously errors that I started to see. And so I went not only to the Smithsonian Institution and looked at collections, but I went to their anthropological museum and found archival materials there. There was a man in Madison, Wisconsin, a professor, Davis, who wanted to write a biography of Jim Bridger in the 1880s. And I've looked at his files, and he wrote to several people, including Stevenson, who was a noted anthropologist for the Smithsonian. And Stevenson said, I studied Jim Bridger as if he was actually a part of natural history. He was so unique as a character. And Bridger knew how to tell a funny tale. He had been telling them about the geysers in Yellowstone. Some people were believing him, some people weren't, but obviously they were true. One day, Jimmy said he woke up and he had a boil on his face, and Jim Bridger said, Jimmy, you got a geyser on your face.
Oh,
He said, oh no, not. So he was very quick and witty. He loved to talk to people. What he loved to do most, he loved to capture the whole landscape in his mind. And whenever anybody asked, he would start drawing a map. He would draw a map, sometimes in the dirt with a knife, sometimes a piece of charcoal and right on his wall in his cabin. He would be doing as much as he could to just tell them all the things that they may find ahead. He was brave, he was adventuresome, he was very compatible and companionable. He had tremendous integrity, and he found himself to be in a very important place for over 40, actually for 6 decades.
Somebody wrote in a moment ago that they find you to be clearly the most knowledgeable person ever about Jim Bridger, and I think that's true. What, though, personally, Jerry, drew you to this? Because you were doing a lot of work getting a museum on the Mississippi River open. Why Bridger? Had you spent time in Bridger country in the Rockies, or what attracted you to his story?
Actually, it was watching the movie Jeremiah Johnson on television. I loved the movie. Robert Redford played a tremendous role in that. The next morning, I went to look at a local library, a very small library, and I couldn't find anything about Bridger, I mean, substantial, except almost every place I looked, they named the top 5 or 6 pioneers and frontiersmen of renown, and Bridger was always one of them. And I knew the others. I knew Carson, I knew Boone, I knew Crockett. I didn't know Bridger, so I started looking. Interestingly enough, I spent a summer in Milwaukee, and that's where I really got a lot of my research done. Just maybe a mile or less from Boswell Books is University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And that's where I started to really absorb and go through all the secondary sources that had been written. They had a very good library there. But then I realized I needed to go to the Huntington Library, which I did, and I found out about his trip to California. He went twice in 1841, trading at the Pueblo de Los Angeles. It wasn't a city yet. This was all Mexican territory. And he also went down to the Sea of Cortez, or the Bay of California, and came back with amazing tales and great interest in exploring everywhere that he'd explored. So I found documents there. I found many documents at the Missouri Historical Society. There's a number of, well, there's probably over 25 different repositories, which I spent a lot of time at and got a lot of material, people writing books, or I mean, writing letters to him, or actually writing letters that he's dictating to somebody else.
What about his, well, were you frustrated that he wasn't a writer, that he didn't have diaries or journals for some of these trips? And did that at any moment make you think, God, can I pull this off without that treasure trove of primary sources?
That did concern me. And in fact, it concerned some of the agents that I tried to secure to represent me. They looked at it and said, it's a fascinating story, but without his words, you're not really going to make a compelling story about it. And that just made me dig in deeper, and I just went further and further. And some of this, you know, part of writing history is interpretation. And I truly believe that Bridger found his home in the West. And he rarely came back to the States. And when he did, actually, he got sick, and he said, I want to go back to the mountains. And so he did go back to the mountains and was living there. And for many years in the 1860s, he was a guide to many US Army captains and generals. Sometimes, though, there was a gap, maybe 4 months or so, where he wasn't actually guiding. Did he go home to Kansas City? No. He actually slept on the floor or on a cot in the storeroom of the sutler store at Fort Laramie. This is how much he loved being out in the West. And even after he retired in 68, and when he was 68, he said to a neighbor, he said, if my eyes were still good, I would be out in the West the whole time. I would not be here. I would go out, but I can't survive out in the West with my eyes failing so much. So he desperately loved the West. And so one of his big challenges was he ran into a conflict with Brigham Young and the Church of Latter-day Saints. And they felt he was trading goods and alcohol to the Ute Indians, who at the time were in dispute with the Mormons. And so they actually created a treason, an arrest warrant for treason against the United States of America. He had to leave his home. And I think it broke his heart. He never really got over the loss of the fort that he built, Fort Bridger, and lived in for 10 years, and probably talked to 100,000 travelers who were passing on their way to Oregon or California. And he got the privilege of telling them what they were going to see. And every day, I think he woke up saying, you know, oh, good, there's more people. I can tell them how the trail will be. I can tell them do this and do that. And he's just a charming man.
Yeah, so incredible raconteur, or, you know, but how do you determine what's a tall tale when he's, you know, stories that he's fabricated or exaggerated versus a story that's your instinct tells you it's true?
It's easy to tell which ones are true because he's talking about the obsidian glass, and he's talking about petrified forests. He's talking about geysers. He's talking about Two Ocean Creek. All these things which do exist. Where the tall tales come, you know, when he would say things like he was being chased by, you know, 30 Indians, and he was getting a good head start on them. But there was one Indian who was coming very close and kept following him, and it got down to just the two of them, and they were going across, and finally they reached a cliff, and Bridger didn't know whether he would stop and fight and maybe get killed. Turns out that he and the Indian rode off the cliff, and then he stops his story, and they said, well, what happened? And they said, well, I died. So it's pretty easy to tell when he's telling a story and when he's actually telling the truth. And he told the truth, and this was recorded by Captain Stansbury in 1849, a number of them, Reynolds in 1859, Ferdinand Hayden, who had discovered dinosaurs just a few years earlier, dinosaur fossils, G.K. Warren, the great map maker, all of them recorded accurately his depiction of Yellowstone. The editor of a newspaper in Kansas City wrote a big story about all of this. And then someone said, oh, those are old Jim Bridger's lies. Don't print them. So he never printed them. Come 1872, when Yellowstone National Park becomes the first national park in the world, the newspaper actually printed a public apology to Bridger for doubting him in 1857. And now in 1872, they concurred that he was correct all the time.
How did he deal with the Civil War as a Western scout? Did he take sides with the Union or Confederates?
I think he was definitely on the side. Well, he was on the side of the Union. His son, Felix, enlisted in the Union Army. His son-in-law, Alfred Watchman, he was actually, I think, a captain in the Missouri Army, the Union Army. And Bridger was working directly for the Union Army throughout the Civil War, but he was stationed out west. So he was stationed at Fort Laramie and Fort C.F. Smith, Fort Phil Kearny, and several others. So he was constantly in demand. He was the most significant guide for the U.S. Army on the plains throughout that whole 1860s period.
He never really had a moment of going eastward and being touted or commercialized as a public speaker. Why is that? Why didn't he capitalize on his legend by going east for a while?
Well, he certainly could have. I mean, Daniel Boone did. Davy Crockett, there was a play written about him, and he was elected to Congress. Kit Carson was a friend of Bridger's, and actually Bridger was his mentor. And he was made famous by the Fremont Diaries. I think his lack of being able to read and write, I think it was a stumbling block in a sense. And Carson couldn't read a lot, but he had the advantage of being with Fremont, and Fremont had the advantage of Jessie, his wife, who wrote excellent diaries and made his work so interesting. And I think he just really wanted to live among the West. He wanted to meet and greet people and be with them and help them, as opposed to trying to be a famous person. He did go to Washington, D.C. once.
Yes.
After he lost his house and the Mormons took possession of it. He may or may not have been guilty of selling alcohol and guns to those Ute Indians. But anyway, he went, stayed in the Browns Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., which was a landmark for many years. And he was with Thomas Fitzpatrick. And Fitzpatrick actually died in 1854. Bridger was with him in the Browns Hotel when Fitzpatrick died. And they were actually, because of Bridger's testimony, they were going to change the boundaries of the Kansas-Nebraska bill and take land that was supposed to be going to Utah territory and put it into Nebraska territory. And now it's Wyoming. But it infuriated Brigham Young that, in fact, Brigham Young said, if members of Congress think that Jim Bridger is the oracle of all things West, and then he made a little profanity about what he thought about that. And then he also said, and if Bridger were to come back here to Utah and act the way he's acted, if we were to employ the laws of the land, then we would string Bridger up between heaven and earth.
Yeah.
So that's why it was difficult for him to come back to Utah, a territory where Fort Bridger was. So he lived in Kansas City, but he spent most of his time actually at Fort Laramie.
So he had a an enemy. The Mormons were opposed to Bridger. What about Native people, and what was his relationship with various Western tribes?
Well, when they were first going up the river, the Assiniboine, in 1822, Bridger was 18, they stole a number of horses, but that wasn't as bad as the following year. There was a tremendous battle with the Arikara in 1823, and 13 of Ashley's trappers were killed. So they realized that the Missouri was actually dead to them. You know, Lewis and Clark went up the Missouri, and then Manuel Lisa and all the exploration trips and trading trails went up the Missouri River. Ashley and Henry and Bridger, one of their men, they actually went overland and started what became then the Oregon Trail. And there they met the Shoshone, who were very friendly and very eager to have the goods from the American traders. Also the Crows, also the Bannock, although they did like to steal horses at times. Also the Nez Perce and many others. Most of their conflict was with the Blackfeet. And there were three versions, two groups that they mainly were challenged by. One was the Blood Blackfeet, and the other was a pagan Blackfeet. And they had a very strong alliance with the Hudson Bay Company. And so they were saying, well, we're getting our rifles and our ammunition and whatever we need from Hudson Bay. We don't need the American trappers in trapping on our land. But that was the rich beaver fields. And so there was a lot of animosity between the American trappers and the Blackfeet. Now, by 1850s, Bridger traded with the Blackfeet, and it was that controversy was over. He had a difference of let me put it this way: the U.S. Army had a difference of opinion with the Sioux Indians, the Lakota, in particular Red Cloud, but they did not take it out against Bridger. Bridger actually said, do not take the Bozeman Trail, which went through the land that was claimed by the Sioux, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. And so much so that he actually developed a new trail called the Bridger Trail, which went through the Crow land. And the Crows were excited to have the miners who were going to Idaho and Montana go that route. Red Cloud stopped some people on the Bozeman Trail, and he said, don't go this way, this is our land, take the Bridger Trail. And so there was a connection between the Sioux and Bridger as well, although it ultimately turned out that Bridger had to guide U.S. Army and try to keep them alive. And there was the soldiers and the Army did not listen to Bridger, and there were 3 years of war that resulted from that. And the U.S. actually had to finally surrender to Red Cloud and remove their forts. And it's the only U.S. Army defeat of with the Plains Indians, and all because they didn't pay attention to Bridger's advice.
Can you hike Bridger's Trail today if people were doing summer recreation, or does it exist anymore in any meaningful way?
Well, the Wyoming Historical Society for many years did hikes, in the 1930s and 40s, and I saw their diaries and everything. And so sometimes they need to go on to a farmer's land or a rancher's land. Sometimes there's open spots for it. So there's places you can see where Bridger's Ferry used to be. Bridger built a lot of ferries on the Green River, over the Platte River. He got his start after he was orphaned. He was actually running a ferry boat across the Mississippi River when he was 12 years old. So you can follow it in general, and there's an excellent book written about the Bridger Trail, which really documents it very well. There's another one by Susan Badger Doyle, which gives all the journals of not all, but most of the journals about the people who traveled on the Bridger Trail and the Bozeman Trail.
And there's a Bridger National Forest today, correct?
Yeah, the Bridger Teton National Forest. It's right next to and part of a Teton National Park. There's a town of Bridger in Montana. There's a Bridger Creek in Montana and Wyoming. There's a Bridger Mount. There's a Bridger Pass. The Bridger Pass, South Pass was a very famous traveling pass because you went across the Continental Divide, but you had to go north in latitude and then down south in latitude. Well, Bridger and many others of his era were aware of this pass where you could go. It became the Overland Trail. It became then the railroad route, and then it became Interstate 80 today. It had been used by many people, including Bridger. Bridger used it many times, and he showed Howard Stansbury that route in 1850. And so Stansbury said that that should be named the Bridger Trail.
Where's Bridger buried?
Bridger was buried in Kansas City, and initially it was actually closer to Westport or Dallas, a town called Dallas. There was a general that he worked with, Grenville Dodge, who was very significant in the railroad, the National Cross-Country Railroad, but also was very significant in the Plains Indian Wars, and Bridger was his chief scout. And so he felt that Bridger's grave had been kind of abandoned. So Grenville Dodge wrote a monograph in 1905, published it, and also created a monument and actually had his remains moved to the library or the cemetery in Independence, Missouri. And there's a fantastic monument there. It's worth a visit to go see the monument tribute to Jim Bridger.
Is this is outside the box question, but did Harry Truman ever contemplate Bridger? Did you ever hear see any literature about Truman and Bridger?
No, I never did. I never did. I know that there's a character in Jeremiah Johnson. He said, I was the son of the grizzly that bit Jim Bridger's ass. There's another one that I think Tom Cruise is saying something about, I'm a descendant of Jim Bridger and I know how to fight, and we're going to fight these Nazis. So he comes up in popular media. And of course, he came up in The Revenant, the movie The Revenant, and played a role there. Now, that was very fictitious. A lot of it was fictitious, but it was a wonderful movie, tremendous movie.
Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was remarkable. You know, I read also in the Beat Generation writer Jack Kerouac wrote about Jim Bridger when he was doing On the Road in his diaries, imagining that sort of what that Bridger to Kerouac represented a type of spirit of the Western frontiersman. Is he like an archetype, or was he a one-off, or is he just a symbol of a certain rough and ready backwoods, type that maybe we don't produce anymore in America? Is the Bridger, do we have Jim Bridger's types in the US anymore?
We do. I think, well, the astronauts have gone to the moon, and others, I mean, they may be Bridger types, although they had a lot of support. Well, here's what Washington Irving said. These men call themselves mountaineers. A totally different class has now sprung up. He's writing about the 1820s. He's writing about Bridger, Fitzpatrick, Jedediah Smith. The mountaineers, the traders and trappers that scale the vast mountain chains and move from place to place on horseback, heedless of hardship, daring of danger, prodigal of the present, and thoughtless of the future. There is, perhaps, no class of men on the face of the earth who lead a life of more continued exertion, peril, and excitement. That's by Washington Irving it was published, I think, in 1833 or 34. It's the story of Captain Bonneville, but he's talking about this class of men who are so unique, and Bridger was perhaps one of the most unique among them. Now, there are others like Jedediah Smith and William Sublette who had similar kind of character, but their lives were short-lived, or their time out west was short-lived. Sublette maybe spent 15, 20 years. Bridger spent 40 years out on the plains and in the Rocky Mountains. He didn't want to come back. He went back. He tried to visit his home in the American Bottom. He stayed in a hotel in St. Louis. He was very uncomfortable. He became ill, and he said, "I have to go back to the mountains." And there's documentation, a story written in a San Francisco paper. It was either 1896 or 1906. A person who remembered that very thing. And Bridger said, "Well, come out and visit me. I'm going west. I don't care what, everybody thinks I might want to stay in St. Louis. I am going back west."
Did he get paid good money as a guide? I mean, was he able to make a substantial living doing this?
Yeah, he made very good money. At first, he wasn't one of the first ones to jump on as a guide. I mean, really the ones who actually came to Kansas City and St. Louis more often. So Kit Carson was hired to be a guide for Fremont and made good money. Tom Fitzpatrick happened to be selected, and he was a wonderful guide. But when Bridger was guiding in the 1850s and 1860s, he was making $10 a day. The other scouts were under him, making $5 a day. Soldiers were making $1 to $2 a day. And he just lived off the land. I mean, some people might take their money and spend it at the fort store or on cards, gambling, whatever. Bridger didn't. And so I'm looking at every month, his balance keeps rising, $300 from the first month and 600 and 900, suddenly it's up to $1,700, which is a heck of a lot of money back then in the 1860s. But he had everything he needed. He had food, he had a horse, he had a gun, and he would still sometimes sleep on a sleeping bag or a blanket on the floor, or not only on the floor, but actually out in the wild. Get up the next morning and go out. He lived a very frugal life, but he made a significant amount of money, and he kept that money with Robert Campbell in his bank in St. Louis. So he was able to buy what's called the old Thatcher farm in Kansas City. And he actually bought several pieces of property, some of them at the beginning of the Santa Fe Trail, what's called New Santa Fe. And he had a trading post there. And then he dealt in cattle, and, these immigrants would come out and their horses and their oxen would just be exhausted. So Bridger would sell them well-rested oxen, and he would he'd give them 2 oxen for 4 exhausted oxen. Well, then he just kept them until they grew, and recuperated. And there's documentation that I found of he would be getting checks for $6,000 of oxen one year, 4,000 another year. He was very shrewd. He knew how to make money, but he really wasn't trying to make money. He was trying to just stay out there in the West, and he loved it.
So who would inherit? His son inherited that money when he died?
Felix died while he was still living, unfortunately. I think it was 1976, a few weeks after Custer was annihilated at the Little Bighorn. When he died, he had 3 children. He had Virginia and Mary Elizabeth and William. And so all 3 of them inherited. And there's a deed at Fort Bridger where Bridger deeds his whole state, was 297 acres, to his daughter Virginia, and she lived the longest. And he said, for the price, he said $1. I'm giving you this land, or selling this land for $1, and for all the love and affection that you have given me throughout my life, he wrote to his daughter. And so she was she was living with her husband. Another daughter, they called her Mary Elizabeth. She would actually come in the evenings. This is in his very later years, and 2 to 3 times a night she would come in to make sure that his covers had stayed on and that he was warm enough. And then his son William liked to play the violin, and he would play at social events. And Bridger always enjoyed listening to that. He reached a time where he was almost totally blind, but he wasn't going to be kept back. So he got on his horse and he just rode his horse about, and the dog followed. And then if he got into a place where, the horse didn't know where to go and he didn't know where to go, he just stayed there, and the dog went running back and, barking to Virginia. Then Virginia would get on a horse and ride out, follow the horse or follow the dog, and actually bring him back home.
It's just such a remarkable story, Jim Bridger, and you bring it all to life in this book, Jerry. Let's mention though, Bridger in 21st century America. We've been seeing monuments taken down of certain historical figures, a lot of debating of history. Should we be honoring Bridger in the 21st century? What's the case to be made for school kids, for example, to learn about Bridger's story?
Well, for example, in 1838, the smallpox had gone up the river. This is very similar to the vaccines we're talking about now. The United States was not blind to the fact that smallpox was decimating the indigenous people. And so they actually allocated, I think it was $32,000 to inoculate the Indians on the Missouri River. Well, they underestimated the cost, and they only got as far as the Mandans in the Dakota. So the Blackfeet Indians were suffering terribly. So this is an example of Bridger's moral code. Bridger was leading a group of maybe 60 employees and another 40 what they call free trappers, including Kit Carson and a man named Joe Meek and Osborne Russell and many others who left diaries. And so they could see that the Blackfeet had been leaving their dead behind on the trail they were following. And they had died of smallpox. They could see the marks on their faces. Carson particularly, as well as Meek and Russell, they said, let's go get them. They've been fighting our men for a long time. Let's go defeat them and let's go annihilate their village. And Bridger said, no, we're not doing that. So Bridger took them on a different route. Well, these free trappers went and followed them anyway and actually engaged the Blackfoot village suffering from smallpox in battle. The missionaries came out a few months later and they were horrified at what these free trappers had done. But they had great respect for Bridger because he had opposed that. And, he didn't control them. He couldn't stop them. But there were many instances. And the other one, he said, did not want to go across the Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne land. He wanted to save lives and he wanted to not trespass on others. One of the things that all of America was guilty of was after Lewis and Clark, so many people went west who actually profit from the beaver pelts, which they could find, or the beaver they could find in the lands of the Three Forks and the Rocky Mountain areas. And I said before, the Shoshone, the Crow, the Flathead, the Nez Perce, they welcomed the Americans. The Blackfeet did not welcome them, and there was maybe 15, 18 years of battles. Bridger basically just tried to defend themselves. Some of the free men who were traveling under Bridger wanted to start a battle whenever they could with the Blackfeet. They thought it was an ongoing war, and Bridger was just trying to trap beaver and not fight with anyone.
I'm done interrogating you, but we have some people that are on with us, Jerry, that had a couple of questions. So I'm going to throw these two at you. One is they're asking, was he an equestrian? Was he known as a good horse person?
Oh, he was, and he had a very fast horse. I wrote an article in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. There was one horse called Orogoho by Joe Meek and Otholoho by another historian. And I've documented and proved that this was actually the same horse. This is a horse that was brought over by William Drummond Stewart, who came from Merthley Castle in Scotland. And I also went there on my journey also to that castle. But so Bridger had that horse, and some said it was worth thousands of dollars, and Bridger would race that horse and during the rendezvous, and there were all kinds of bets being placed. And there's one notice that said that he would have won every race except one time someone tampered with the horse before the race and did not win that one. So he was a very good horseman, and they raced, and he was also very good at hunting on the horse. David L. Brown wrote he recorded in 1837, and it was published in 1845 in the Cincinnati Atlas, saying that Bridger was known he could actually drop 20 buffalo in 20 consecutive shots, which was enormously good shooting. If you're riding in the middle of a herd of buffalo and you're shooting here and there, every single shot of his was effective.
There's a question on, was he, I'm condensing it, but is he part of a political party, or did he favor a particular, political group?
No, he wasn't much political. There's a letter he wrote to Jim Beckworth. Jim Beckworth was a black man, was a trapper with him. He was living in Denver. So Bridger had someone write a letter, and the person couldn't spell very well. And they said, Bridger said, the Union is in danger, or something like, the Union is all upside down. Lincole, Lincole, wrote the writer, is president, and everyone's protesting. So that's about as close as he got, being party affiliate. I mean, he worked for so many different people, but almost all of them were Union. Although his next door neighbors were very staunch Confederates. They actually fought for the Confederacy, his neighbors in Kansas City.
Well, Jerry, it's an incredible book. I urge everybody to buy Jim Bridger. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for reconstructing a life that had been foggy and unclear until you entered the historiographic terrain. And are you, the last question, and this I guess comes from me, but it's also my wife, Ann is with me, and she wanted to know what you're up to after this. Did this exhaust you doing Jim Bridger, or did it excite you to do a new project coming up?
I am going to be excited to do a new project, but right now I'm trying to market this book. I really want to tell this story because I think it's America's story. So
I hope it becomes a movie. We need a new Jeremiah Johnson type film, and Jim Bridger would be it.
We did. Well, I did go out to the Sundance and try to pitch, but they said, no, we can't read your pitch because, you know, copyright issues. But I'm going on tour in Wyoming, both in July and Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, and then in September as well.
Well, good, happy travels. I hope you saw a lot. Stay in touch. And somebody wrote, thank you for coming. Oh, the bookstore, Chris Lee is telling us, make sure you purchase your copy right now. It's special that we're able to do this. And thank you everybody for tuning in. Jerry, we'll be in touch soon. Godspeed and enjoy your tour.
Thank you so much.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Well, let me join the thanking here. Douglas, Jerry, thank you both so much for a fascinating conversation. This has been a wonderful evening, and I want to thank everybody who came. We wouldn't have a bookstore, virtual or otherwise, without you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.